Thank you very much. It's a special privilege to return this afternoon for the purposes of introducing our keynote speaker, because I've had a long and very cordial relationship, for the most part, with Jon Wolfsthal. I say for the most part. You may think that the ban treaty is a controversial issue, but it pales in comparison to issues of the Yankees versus the Tigers, or the Nationals versus the Dodgers. And I'm afraid to say that our speaker is on the wrong side all the time on those matters. He may be on the wrong side with respect to the Prohibition Treaty as well, but I'll leave that for you to decide. As I mentioned, or alluded to at least in my opening remarks this morning, a major emphasis of our activities in the disarmament and nonproliferation education area is to help individuals. I was going to say young individuals, but in some respects I think it's older individuals who need the help more than anyone, to develop critical thinking skills. Our emphasis, and the reason why we were able to gain consensus in this UN experts group, which represented countries with very, very different perspectives, was to focus not on what to think, but rather on how to think. And so I think it's really important, as we address the topic of the Prohibition Treaty, to hear from individuals who have different perspectives. I don't think there's a right perspective or a wrong perspective, but it's important for you to appreciate the nuances associated with the issue. And so I'm quite certain that our speaker this afternoon will help you in that regard. He is Jon Wolfsthal. He's the director of the Nuclear Crisis Group at Global Zero. He has a very distinguished career in government. When I sought to recruit him to come to Monterey a number of years ago, he was then serving as a special advisor to Vice President Biden. When he got tired of working for me, he thought he'd take an easier job in the White House, where he had responsibility for nuclear issues. I think he probably thought it was an easier boss to work with in any case. But he has an extraordinary range of both interests and experiences that are relevant to our discussion. I know in the first presentation that was made by the Pacific Grove High School, there was reference made to defense spending and the trillion-dollar budget. And in fact, that was an issue that Jon was intimately involved with and published on the topic before it became a kind of a more household familiar name. Jon has been involved at the center of power within the United States on issues of nuclear issues. That means that today he is outside of the center of decision-making by virtue of having served previously in the Obama administration. But that doesn't mean that the work he is doing is any less important. And so it's really a great pleasure to welcome back to Monterey my good friend and our keynote speaker this afternoon, Mr. Jon Wolfsthal. Thank you, Jon.
Thank you so much. That's great. So I really don't need any mics, and I have two, so. And now I got to make sure I don't go on too long. Never give somebody from Washington, D.C. a microphone. So, hi. It's really nice to be here. Thank you, Bill, very much for the kind invitation. Thank you to Masako for inviting me back to Monterey. And thank you to all of you for coming. It's your effort, your interest, your time, your thinking that made it worthwhile for me to come here today. I generally say yes when Bill invites me when I can. I always say yes when Masako invites me because she also has poured her heart and her critical thinking into these conferences, and they are really, I think, where our efforts and investments pay off. People at my age, people at Bill's age, we already know what we think. We're pretty sure we're right. Bill and I are unusual because we can adjust our thinking from time to time if we're presented with new information. But you are the individuals that will be driving these issues for the next generation. And so giving you this opportunity to work together, to think about these issues, and to get a little bit of insight from someone like me who started out in your position and then has gone on to work on these issues professionally, hopefully will be of interest to you. So what I thought I would do today, and I was talking with your other keynote speaker for tomorrow at lunch, she asked, well, what is it you're going to tell us? What are you going to try and convince us of? I'm not going to try and convince you of anything. My job here is to try to help give you some insight into what it's like to work on these issues inside the US government. I have my own perspective. You can read about those things. You can ask me my opinion when we're done in the question and answer. But really what I hope you will get out of the presentation is a sense that while there are people in big buildings in Washington or in Moscow or in Pyongyang or in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem, and they actually control decision-making on these issues, you know more. You have more information at your disposal. You have worked on these issues for more time, even now, than most of the politicians that work on these issues in all of the governments in the world. Now, that's both encouraging, because you now have the information you need, but it's also scary, because these are big, dangerous weapons, and you would hope that our presidents, our senators, our congressmen would spend more time than high school students working through these issues. But they haven't. What they have had is the opportunity to be in positions of authority and power. And that is what you will have at some point in your lives, and you will have to decide in what area. Do you want it to be in nuclear policy? Do you want it to be in human security? Do you want it to be in defense issues? But I'm living proof that if you care about these issues and you sustain yourself, you can end up in those positions and having an influence on the system. And it's wonderful the work that you're doing to share information with your colleagues. It's very valuable to be lobbying your elected representatives and send the petitions. But it is something else entirely to sit with the president or the chairman or the general, and he turns or she turns to you and say, well, I don't know about this issue, what should I think? And if you're in that sort of position, you can really have an influence, and I hope, if not all of you, some of you will continue in that trajectory, because if you do, we will end up better off than where we are today. And I don't think enough people have started at your age with your passion and sustained it long enough to really have an impact later on in life. So what I'll do for this presentation is I'll give you a little bit of my perspective on what's going on in current events on nuclear issues. It is a busy time to be working on our issues. And then I will turn to the ban treaty, because I know it is of great interest to the audience. And while it is not a major topic in the United States, I know that it is a major topic in other countries. And so giving you some insight into why the US government has been so, let's just say, on the one hand, skeptical, ranging all the way to hostile on the ban treaty, to help you understand that it's not a question of motivation, it's a question of perspectives. And we can talk a little bit about that in the question and answer. So the main current event issues I wanted to touch on today are North Korea, a little bit of Russia and the US relationship with Russia, and then also a little bit on Iran, because I think we're going to get more news out of the nuclear relationship with Iran soon. For North Korea, obviously, you've been tracking day to day what's going on between President Trump, Kim Jong-un, the summit between Kim Jong-un and President Xi. You're wondering what's happening. What is the plan? What is Donald Trump and his staff laying out for him so that they can make progress on this issue? I've been working on North Korea policy for 30 years, and I can't answer that question, because there is no plan right now. There is no strategic thought behind what President Trump is doing, behind what the South Korean government is doing, behind what the North Korean government is doing, behind what the Chinese government is doing. They're really making it up as they go along. And I apologize in advance if at the end of this discussion you're really depressed. But there's a lot of confusion right now in our North Korean policy, because it's not we're not used to government working this way. I'm a former bureaucrat, recovering bureaucrat. I've worked in the Department of Energy. I've worked in the White House. I write memos. I work with my counterparts to determine what might work and what might not work. What are the risks of a certain policy? What are the potential benefits for a certain policy? And I orchestrated a discussion with my foreign ministry, State Department colleagues, with my defense officials, with my uniformed military, with the intelligence services. And we would lay out these very well, okay, not always very well written, but we would lay out these well-written memos that talked about the pros and cons of different issues. And methodically, we would work through, okay, what is the policy on North Korea? If they test a missile, how will we respond? How will we coordinate with the Chinese? How will we make sure that the Japanese government, the South Korean government, and the US government are well synchronized and coordinating these issues? We're not doing any of that work right now. President Trump attends a meeting with a South Korean official who says, we met with Kim Jong-un, and he said maybe we should have a summit with the US leader, and he said, yeah, do that. Go out and announce it. The President of the United States heard about an idea in the Oval Office, agreed to it without any input from his advisors, told the South Korean officials to go to the White House lawn and announce a summit, and the South Korean officials had to call back to President Moon Jae-in in the Blue House to say, President Trump wants us to announce that he's going to meet with the North Koreans. Can we do that? And Moon Jae-in would say, yeah, do that. He didn't listen to his advisors either. So it literally is just snap decisions. That doesn't make it a bad decision, but it makes it very uncomfortable for bureaucrats like me who like to know what the risks are. How do we reduce the risks by coordinating with our allies in advance? What's the intelligence community thinking? What information do we have about this? But into this environment where looks like we're going to have a summit meeting between Kim Jong-un and President Trump, we also have, I think, some misunderstandings about what might actually happen, which could have longer-term negative consequences for both the U.S. relationship in the region, particularly with South Korea, but also with Japan and China. If you read the news and you listen to the language that is used by the White House, by the Blue House in South Korea, about why we're going to have this summit, it's all about the North Korean leader having said, we are prepared to talk about denuclearizing the Korean Peninsula. To American ears, that is a change. That is a decision by Kim Jong-un to talk about giving up his nuclear weapons. But to the people who work here at Monterey, to the people that are in South Korea, to people that are in North Korea, they know that is what North Korea has been saying for decades. When they talk about denuclearizing the Korean Peninsula, they talk about the United States and its extended deterrent to protect South Korea no longer being welcome on the peninsula. And so Donald Trump thinks that he's had this tremendous breakthrough. And there's a very great risk that when he goes and meets with Kim Jong-un and finds out that there hasn't been this great breakthrough, he's going to get disappointed. And the last year has shown that when he has a choice to make, does he accept responsibility for his own actions, or does he blame somebody else, he's going to look for somebody to blame. And right now, the South Korean government, our close ally, who depends on us for their security, is in the crosshairs. Because they are the ones who've gone to President Trump and said, your strategy is working. Maximum pressure has brought North Korea to the table, something that President Obama couldn't do, and you have a chance to make peace. Now, I understand why the South Korean government is doing this. They are as worried about Donald Trump starting a shooting war on the Korean Peninsula as they are Kim Jong-un starting a shooting war, right? The United States has been the guarantor of peace on the Korean Peninsula for 50 plus years. The threat has always been seen as coming from North Korea. The population in South Korea has sometimes debated this. The younger generation is more skeptical of the US presence on the peninsula than the older generation. But generally, more people than not view North Korea as a threat. Today, we have senior officials close to Moon Jae-in coming to the United States and saying, we think Donald Trump is dangerous. And so the South Koreans have decided they can't rely on the United States for their security anymore. They need to go and work their own deals with North Korea. They have to try to for lack of a better term, manipulate President Trump's thinking on these issues to push him into a diplomatic approach that he has been unwilling to take until now. So I can't sit here and tell you how the strategy will play out because it could all change tomorrow. There may be a summit. The summit might get canceled. The South Koreans might decide they don't support it anymore because they're going to have their own summit meeting. We have had Kim Jong-un go to Beijing. There's debates about why he went and what they've agreed to, but I don't think anybody can tell you how this movie is going to play out, which is in part what Donald Trump wants. This is a great ratings opportunity for President Trump, and we're all addicted now to our Twitter feed and TV stations. What we do know is that North Korea continues to have nuclear weapons. They continue to have ballistic missiles. They continue to have a very large conventional military. And the risks of an accidental conflict on the Korean Peninsula remain quite high. You have 27,000 American troops. You have a large number of South Korean military in close proximity to the north. And if one thing has been proven over time, it's that accidents can and do happen. A helicopter can go down. A fishing vessel can stray into the wrong waters at the wrong time. We know now that the Russian government tried to hack the South Korean Olympic opening ceremony and make it look like North Koreans. So there are all kinds of third-party or uncontrollable events that in the wrong time, in the wrong environment, can lead to an escalation that no one can control. And that's, I think, in many of your presentations, you recognize that people think that they can control nuclear weapons, that if we're smart enough to invent them, then we can control the environment. And history has proven time and again that we can't. Accidents happen even with nuclear weapons, even with the investments that we make in trying to control them. So let me move on quickly to the situation with Russia and then a little on Iran. I won't sit here and tell Bill Potter how bad things are, but things are bad. The U.S.-Russia relationship, I think, is now at as low a point as we have seen since the very intense days of the Cold War, probably as dangerous as any time since the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is what sparked the growth of nuclear arms control, which led to the treaties to ban atmospheric testing, to start limiting nuclear weapons between the United States and the Soviet Union and later Russia. And yet we are back in that environment that I entered into the scene in the mid-1980s. I started as an anti-nuclear protester in high school supporting the Freeze movement in New York when I was 14 years old, so younger than most of you, less well-informed than all of you, less eloquent than all of you, and without the same resources that you have at your disposal, recognizing that war could break out at any minute. And that was a war that could be sparked by a quest for global dominance by the United States or by the Soviet Union that we don't have today, but that could still happen because of either accident, miscalculation, or misinterpretation. There is real palpable concern in Washington, particularly in the US military, that Russia has not only the will, but the capability to initiate a conflict on NATO territory, and if they were to start losing a conventional war with NATO, to escalate to the use of nuclear weapons. This is what dominates the thinking inside the Pentagon. And at least one presentation talked about the US Nuclear Posture Review. Everybody should read it because I think it is an accurate reflection of how the Pentagon, both the the civilians in the Pentagon and the uniformed military in the Pentagon think about Russia and think about the relationship, the nuclear relationship with Russia today. And their answer for how to deal with these risks of nuclear crisis, the risk of nuclear escalation, is not engagement. It's not arms control. It's not confidence-building measures. It's not utilizing technology. It's, well, we need to build more nuclear weapons ourselves. We need to make more usable nuclear weapons so that our threat of using them is seen as credible so that we won't have to use them. It's the illogic of nuclear deterrence, which in its own confines makes sense, but to your parents or to your cousins or to your friends who aren't here and don't spend a lot of time thinking about nuclear issues think is nuts, because it is nuts. But that's the environment and the structure that we've built up for ourselves. So in this environment, you have the United States engaged in a multi-decade long, trillion-dollar-plus modernization of its own nuclear forces. And you have Russia in the midst of its own multi-decades-long, multi-hundreds of billions of rubles investment in their own nuclear forces. And to the rest of the world, it looks like a replay of the nuclear arms race that we had in the 1960s and 1970s. It's a little different. There have been some good things written on whether or not this is really the Cold War 2.0, whether we're sort of destined to repeat the mistakes of the past. But I think to most casual observers, we're building a lot of new nuclear weapons. The Russians are building a lot of new nuclear weapons. Looks like the Cold War. And we're saber rattling. The expression of President Putin in his campaign speeches saying, we've got all these new nifty nuclear weapons, no one can touch us. And Donald Trump saying, if there's going to be an arms race, let there be an arms race because we'll win it. That's not the language that builds confidence among countries to get out of a crisis should they find themselves in one. And if there's another lesson from history, it's that the United States and Russia will find itself in another crisis at some point. We always do. It could be over Syria, it could be over Iran, it could be over an accident, planes flying into each other, ships getting too close to each other, but it is going to happen. And how our leaders view the other, how our militaries view the other side will have a big impact on whether or not we're able to walk away from that conflict or whether we both decide, you know what, we can't back down in this one, we've got to take it up another notch. And that's the sort of environment that creates a cycle of escalation that no one can control. That turns to a good segue for Iran. One of the many things that I got to work on in the US government was the nuclear agreement with Iran, the United States, and other members of the United Nations Security Council, known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA. Most people that have worked on arms control issues look at that agreement and see it sort of as a natural, recognizable deal. It is a time-bound limit on what Iran is going to be able to do with its capabilities, and we get 15 plus years of security in exchange for some incentives. That's how arms control treaties work. They're usually of limited duration, and both sides get some benefits out of it. Those recognizable features for us are seen as real liabilities by critics of the JCPOA. It doesn't guarantee forever that Iran will be a non-nuclear weapon state, and therefore it is a flawed agreement in the minds of these critics. And worse, it provides incentives to Iran. It gives them access to money, to business. It treats them like a legitimate state, even though they are supporting terrorism, destabilizing the Middle East, and taking action that undermine the security of our allies. Those two realities that we recognize as natural parts of an arms control agreement are seen as unacceptable components of a bad deal, as Donald Trump would say. Of course, the real negative feature of the deal is that it was negotiated by President Obama, because anything President Obama did, Donald Trump has a natural inclination against. But for the non-Trump administration analysts that oppose the JCPOA, it is these drawbacks on limitations and on incentives. It does look like President Trump is going to pull out of this deal. In May, the president must decide whether he will again waive sanctions that are required under US law, but that he can decide not to implement in order to keep the nuclear deal going. The nomination of John Bolton to be the National Security Advisor, who was one of the leading advocates for regime change as a tool of nonproliferation, to go after Saddam Hussein, to go after the leaders in Iran, to go after Kim Jong-il, is likely to reinforce the view that the JCPOA should be terminated, or that at the very least we should threaten to get out of it and force the Europeans to renegotiate the deal with Iran. I don't see a way that that strategy ends up with us being more secure over the long run. The concern is that the United States, which benefits from having alliances that benefits from close relationships with Europe and other states will be more isolated from those countries, and that Iran can very easily restart its nuclear program and can argue legitimately that there's no point in negotiating with the United States because they sign a deal and then they pull out of it. And into that environment, the Trump administration is going to try to get European and allied support for new sanctions on Iran. And I don't see the countries of France, Germany, UK, Russia, China being willing to go along with that strategy. For the Obama administration, we could get very intense implementation of sanctions on Iran because our goal was a negotiated agreement. You pressure the state to change their calculation. Is what I'm doing worth it to me financially to endure this pain? And if it's not, then I'll sit down and negotiate. That is a strategy that at least countries can understand. There is no end game that anybody can see in Donald Trump's strategy other than to dictate the terms of a new deal to Iran in the belief that they have no choice but to capitulate. And again, history has shown that Iran has choices. They won't have to capitulate. They can make our lives very difficult in the Middle East, and they can, by restarting their nuclear program, create leverage over us and our allies that they don't currently have. So that's a nice, cheery 1, 2, 3. Things are going poorly in North Korea, Russia, and Iran. Let's get to the really cheery part of the ban treaty. So I rejoined the U.S. government in December of 2014 after I left my idyllic salad days here in Monterey. And one of the first issues I had to deal with was whether the U.S. would attend one of the humanitarian impact conferences that led to the negotiation of the ban treaty. And my view was, why wouldn't we attend? We have lots of diplomats. The United States is strongly in support of a world without nuclear weapons. The president at the time talked about seeking the peace and security of a world without nuclear weapons. I didn't at the time believe that negotiating a simple treaty that called for the ban of nuclear weapons was the right way to go about it, but I felt that we had a compelling story to tell, and that by participating, the product of those humanitarian impact conferences would be more balanced. That instead of 150 countries coming out and saying the only way to make progress is with a ban treaty, that the reports that would come out would say there's a disagreement. Some people support a ban, other people believe that step-by-step progress on disarmament, negotiations, elimination of current nuclear arsenals is the way to go. So we went to the conference in December of 2014. We presented our views, and the conference report was actually as I expected. The conference report said that there's a disagreement. There are some people who believe one thing, there are some people who believe another. But then there was a different product that came out, the Austrian statement, organized by the Austrian government, that said, regardless of the conference report, there are 150 countries that support negotiation of a ban treaty. And off they went. And at that point, the United States went into the 2015 NPT review conference, which many of you have now studied and will probably be watching the 2020 conference closely, worried that there would be this boxing match in the NPT review conference between those who supported the ban and those who opposed it. Or to put it differently, those who thought the ban was the best way to restart the disarmament process, and those that believed that there were other more practical, pragmatic, proven ways to reduce the risks of nuclear proliferation and nuclear war. And we did have a big debate. There was a big argument, but in the end, both sides were, I think, willing to compromise because they agreed that we shouldn't let that argument over the ban do damage to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. That the treaty itself has a lasting value in setting global norms that should be protected. That being said, and Bill and I talked a lot about this, nobody was happy with that outcome, but it didn't end up being the major issue that prevented the conference from having a consensus document. But since then, I think the situation has gotten much more polarized and I think much more difficult for the two sides, the two camps to really engage each other. And I talk about two camps, there are really, I think, at least three. On the side that supports the ban as the right way to approach these issues, I would say that there's a general consensus that the current system of disarmament is broken, that you see countries increasing their reliance on nuclear weapons. We can't continue to rely on these piecemeal, step-by-step measures. We need to break the old system to build something new. Now, not everybody in that camp wants to tear down the NPT and wants to prove that the current system is flawed, but they are frustrated. And the ban is a legitimate expression of the frustration that many countries have with the pace of disarmament. So you have that group that says, look, the ban is the way to go. On the other side, I think you have people like me and people much more conservative than myself who really believe nuclear weapons are not only here to stay, but they're actually valuable, enduring, beneficial elements of national power, who say the ban is the enemy of stability. We don't love the current system, but you know what? We haven't had a nuclear war. Yes, we have a lot of these things, but we're smart enough to control them. And the ban is going to make deterrence and extended deterrence and nonproliferation illegitimate. And you're going to see a breakdown in the current system. That is the extreme that you hear in the military of the United States. You definitely hear it in the military and security services in France and Russia, and to some extent in the Japanese defense ministry, the Japanese foreign ministry, and other nuclear weapon states. And then you have, I think, everybody in the middle. And I think this is an underappreciated group of states. In some cases, it is the allies of the United States, Japan, Holland, Germany, Italy, Poland, the United Kingdom. It is definitely the non-aligned states that were participants and active in the ban because it was the only game in town, it was the only action going, but that expressed some concern about where the ban went. And you can see it in the statements of Sweden, the statements of Holland at the end of the ban negotiation, where they said, look, we think there's some positive elements to the ban treaty, but in the end, we want to preserve both the non-proliferation treaty and what it has done, and we also want to kick the nuclear weapon states back into gear to get serious about pursuing disarmament, because in the end, if we don't get there soon, we could see a fundamental break with the norms that have kept us safe for a long time. And I think this group of countries is really where hope lies. The extremes always get the attention, but it's the centrists and the moderates that generally dominate a discussion if they want to. And the question is, who's going to take up the leadership position among these group of countries? This is not a great time to be standing up and taking a position in opposition to the Trump administration, right? We are apparently not only willing to lash out at our enemies, we're also prepared to lash out at our friends if they don't always agree with us on everything. And so that's going to be a bit of a problem as countries try to manage what they should say and do about the ban treaty over the next 2 to 3 years. But I think this is really where the interesting parts of the discussion, Bill, and you and I can talk offline, and I want to get your perspectives on whether you think there is actually a group of countries out there that are going to take up some of the leadership. But I think another part of the problem, which then I'll move to my closing remarks, is in Japan, in Europe, in most parts of the world, the ban is a real discussion. There's a high-level commission that was set up in Japan, the Eminent Persons Group. There's a commission set up in Sweden by the Prime Minister to evaluate whether or not the ban can be supported by the government of Sweden. These are high-level national decisions that are being made to deal with the politics of the ban, right? Banning nuclear weapons has a lot of popular support. Who wants to keep nuclear weapons? They're expensive, they're dangerous, they're immoral. But inside the security apparatus, inside the militaries, inside the foreign ministries, there's still strong support for these issues. And so balancing the public opinion against the security, quote, expertise is a tough act for many of these governments to play out. And this is exactly what the proponents of the ban are hoping for. The strategy of the ban, as you probably all understand, is not to present a great idea and expect that countries of their own volition will recognize, oh yes, the time for a ban has come, nuclear weapons are not worth the burden, let's sign. It is a political strategy to start picking off countries one by one to support the ban and to no longer participate in alliances that are backed with nuclear weapons. There's a reason there's an ICANN in most countries, and why ICANN is active in Sweden, in Holland, in Japan, because they're trying to have political support to force politicians to say, my security establishment is telling me I have to have these weapons, but the people who vote for me that keep me in power are saying I have to get rid of them. And in the end, the people in democratic countries win. And that's where, as depressed as I'm sure I have made you, I want to try and leave you with a little bit of hope. One of the presentations this morning talked about the gun control movement in the United States that has taken on new energy in the wake of the Parkland shooting in Florida 6 weeks ago, 2 months ago. These are teenagers your age. They are teenagers armed with nothing but Twitter and a message. One of the things I thought was fascinating, one of the reasons that Emma Gonzalez and David Hogue, the leaders in this movement, have been so eloquent and so prepared is that their debate topic last year was gun control. The shooter picked a school that was prepared to argue for national gun control even before he walked into the school. And now they have a platform, and they are armed with knowledge, they're armed with facts, and they're armed with knowing how to argue in public confidently about this issue. And they are making an impact. You have the knowledge, you have the same tools at your disposal. What is lacking, fortunately, is a defining moment. The ban could be that moment in these different countries. The national debates over whether or not to sign a ban gives you an opportunity to talk about these things. But there are other opportunities. You have the 50th anniversary of the NPT coming up in 2 years. That's not going to grab national headlines, but it is a hook. There are other hooks. Every day, whether it is the August 6th and 9th anniversaries of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, whether it is the anniversary of the invention of the nuclear bomb, major test events, you can create your own media attention around these issues, and you can drive public attention with them. And I'm still hopeful that there will be real debate in the United States, but until that happens, I think you're in a much better opportunity in Japan, in Russia, in foreign countries, and working with your international colleagues to try to drive a discussion about this issue. In the United States, we're still, reacting to every tweet that the president makes, and nobody really can catch their breath. But as I think many of you know, this is a real conversation in other countries, and the ban may be one of the things you can use to drive public attention and action. Is it going to change tomorrow? No. I mean, I wish I could tell you that if you just find the right tweet and get the right number of followers that you can really crack this issue open, but I'm not going to pull your leg and you wouldn't believe it even if I tried. Sometimes there is success in avoiding catastrophe. Sometimes you prevent bad ideas from happening. Right now, the big debate in the United States is, are we going to build new types of nuclear weapons to go on new platforms? Submarine-launched ballistic missiles with small warheads, submarine-launched cruise missiles that could fly without being detected by enemy air defenses. These are bad ideas that we will debate in the Congress and that hopefully we will deny funding for. But sometimes you win by stopping bad ideas. Other times you really win by creating something new. That's what the ban advocates were hoping for, but I don't think the ban is the only good idea out there or the only way you make progress on these issues. Sometimes it's by restarting dialogue with Russia. Sometimes it's by sparking a real debate in Japan about whether nuclear weapons need to be part of your defense and security thinking or not. We have debates on this all the time. I don't doubt, let me put it positively, I fundamentally believe that Japan and the United States can protect Japanese security without nuclear weapons. But that is going against the conventional wisdom that your parents and their parents have believed in for 50 years. Changing things is hard. Inertia exists. And in order to change the way people think, you need to convince them what they're doing is wrong, or you need to replace them. And that's where I'll leave you, is the hope that for many of you, this is not just a wonderful opportunity to come to Monterey and spend time with your colleagues and meet new friends, but really a calling that you will make your life's work. Because if you care about something deeply enough and you get to work on it for your living, it's actually not work. It's actually just doing what you believe in, and that has its own rewards, even if in the end it takes many more years to make progress. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions you may have about things I talked about or other experiences and things that I've worked on. So thank you very much. And if you don't start asking, I'm going to start calling on people, so you should come up. Please. I think there's a microphone for you.
Okay, so you mentioned how there's the nuclear deal with Iran, right? Well, how would the U.S. react if Saudi Arabia put up a nuclear program? Because there have been talks that if Iran restarts it, that Saudi Arabia will just as easily recreate that success.
Yeah, so there's not only just talk. I mean, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia said, I think 2 weeks ago, if Iran builds a nuclear weapon, we're going to build a nuclear weapon. And that's been, I think, a private Saudi Arabian position for many years, that they believe they preserve the stability with Iran by matching their capabilities or being able to surpass them. There's some people in the United States who believe that any proliferation is bad. The more countries that have nuclear weapons, the greater the risk that weapons will be used, the greater the risk that weapons will be stolen or fall into the wrong hands, or that the technology to make nuclear weapons will proliferate, that the people who work in that program might sell their knowledge off to other countries. There are other people who believe that we only care about proliferation when bad countries proliferate, right? It's guns don't kill people, people kill people. And so if our friends, the British or the French, have nuclear weapons, well, what does that matter? Donald Trump, as a candidate, said, you know, if South Korea and Japan build nuclear weapons, that doesn't bother me. They're not going to launch nuclear weapons at us. I'm very strongly on the side that the more proliferation that happens, the worse off we are. Even if I didn't believe that for all countries, the idea that Saudi Arabia developing nuclear weapons, whether Iran has developed them or not, would be a good thing for the Middle East is just far beyond my brain's ability to wrap around. The real question is not whether Saudi Arabia would build nuclear weapons if Iran builds nuclear weapons. The question is, how would they try to do it, and do we have any ability to stop them? And this is where things get complicated, and if you decide to pursue these issues for your life's work, you could go down any million pathways. Let's say I want to influence Saudi behavior. They've decided they want to build a nuclear weapon. Do we say, you know what, you don't need to build nuclear weapons, we'll just sell you more advanced conventional military equipment. We'll support you conventionally so you don't need nuclear weapons. Well, that might work, but the Saudis are using this conventional military capability right now in a proxy war with Iran in Yemen, which is one of the reasons the Trump administration thinks that the nuclear deal with Iran is not working, because we're fighting a war with Iran. So conventional military isn't always the way to preserve peace. It actually can exacerbate these tensions. So maybe you say, well, we'll be partners in the Saudi civilian nuclear program. We'll help them build civilian nuclear power plants so that we will be so involved in their nuclear efforts that if they try to build nuclear weapons, we'll know it very early and we can constrain them. Well, that might work. It's worked in the past. We were very involved in the South Korean nuclear civilian program. We were able to turn off their weapons program. We were involved in the Taiwanese nuclear program. We were able to turn that off. But those two countries had to rely on the United States for their security. Saudi Arabia has choices. They have a lot of money. And if tomorrow we said to Saudi Arabia, look, we're not going to buy any more of your oil and we're not going to sell you any more military equipment if you build nuclear weapons, they'll say, fine, I could sell my oil to China and I'll buy Chinese military equipment, or I'll go to Russia and they'll sell me anything I want. So I do worry about us pulling out of the Iran deal and Saudi Arabia then deciding that they have to follow suit. And I worry that if they decide to do that, we don't have the tools at our disposal to really control them from moving down that pathway. So it is something that I would argue suggests we should stay in the JCPOA. We should find ways to prolong it and make it work better. But that is not a very popular argument in this administration.
Thank you.
Sure. Please. They're going to make you go to the mic.
Just quickly, could you continue to comment on the same topic, but bringing Israel into the equation?
If I hesitate to do so, it's because the foremost expert on Israel's nuclear weapon program is sitting one row up and over from you. Well, I'm trying. There's so many ways to cut that. The way I'll put it is, for all of its capability, Israel's position and its nuclear posture hasn't really been a major problem in the Middle East. I don't know of any countries that actively pursue nuclear weapons because Israel has nuclear weapons. Israel doesn't go around saying we will nuke you if you do this, or if you follow on that pursuit, then you're going to get destroyed. It's sort of the unspoken, worst-kept secret in the world. I guess that's a good title for something, like Abner's book. But it's used as an excuse by countries from time to time, but it really is, in my view, in my experience, not a driver for proliferation. It is a challenge when it comes to managing the non-proliferation regime and the norms, because you do see an imbalance between what Israel has been able to do and escape punishment, and what Egypt and other countries in the Middle East say is pressure that's being put on them to accept more stringent and intrusive obligations while Israel is able to escape them. And on the one hand, it's true. Israel has been able to get a free pass on those issues, but it's also true that Israel never signed a treaty that prohibited them from getting these capabilities, and so played that in a legalistic way more intelligently than perhaps some of the other countries in the region did. So, this is an issue that comes up frequently in international discussions, but when you look at the security calculations, it's not really seen as a major challenge. And if you look at what's going on below the surface in the Middle East, the countries that would be most likely to say publicly, we should never have to accept nuclear restrictions on our country because the Zionists in Palestine possess nuclear weapons, are the ones that have the closest security relationship with Israel, Egypt and Saudi Arabia. They're the ones that are working with Israel to try to deal with Iran and extremists in other countries to keep a lid on the status quo. And so there's a lot of hypocrisy going around when it comes to the public positions of these countries and the non-proliferation experts and the disarmament officials, but that I don't think they're reflected in the real security calculations in those countries. Abner, is that fair? Would you? I learned it from him.
So I was wondering what education pathway you took and what were some of your jobs starting out?
Thank you for asking that, because I have right here, talk about my background, and I got so excited about the substance I skipped right over it. I may be the luckiest person you've ever met in this field, because I keep sort of falling backwards into these phenomenal opportunities and positions. It started with an interest, as I said, as a high school student. I was 14 in 1980, and one of the presidential candidates, actually an independent candidate, John Anderson, just passed away this past year, was campaigning on a platform to freeze all U.S. nuclear weapons and to pursue a 50% reduction in U.S. and Soviet nuclear arsenals. That was his big platform. Ronald Reagan was going to win the Cold War. Jimmy Carter was going to sort of keep negotiating on arms control, but John Anderson was going to change this. And that really inspired me. That was a dramatic, extreme proposal in American debates at the time. So I got involved in the peace movement. I worked with the Public Interest Research Group, PIRG. For those of you that know, it's a valuable organization that works on a number of issues. But I went to college expecting to become a lawyer and do criminal defense, public defender, Clarence Darrow, inherit the wind type stuff. And I had a teacher who had worked in the U.S. government on arms control and discovered at 18 that there are actually people who work professionally on nuclear weapons. I just thought the president made decisions. Of course, now the president just makes decisions. But and by being mentored by her, was able to see exactly what these pathways were. And I had to really think, okay, how am I going to do this, right? The government's the problem. They're the ones that continue to support these things, but I want to get my hands on the levers that actually control those things. And I used to joke that I was sort of channeling my rebellion into the system. That's a nice way older people talk about selling out. But essentially, I decided I didn't want to just hit my head from the outside. I really wanted to work from the inside. Now, remember, the outside 30, 40 years ago, there was no way to tell what was going on, right? If you wanted to find out what your government was doing, you had to wait 4 months for the report to come out. They didn't tweet it. They didn't post it on the internet. There was no televised presidential news conferences, or rarely. You didn't have a daily press briefing. So there's really no way to access that. And so I didn't see a way to have an impact from the outside. Civil society groups were really not dominant actors the way they are today. And so I went to college and went to grad school to work on arms control, and I got a job working for a defense contractor, started to learn about these issues, and then I went to work for a group called the Arms Control Association for 5 years, writing for Arms Control Today magazine, basically covering these issues. From there, I got a job working at the Department of Energy as a U.S. civil servant, and in those positions got to go to North Korea to implement the agreement we had with them in 1994, got to go to most U.S. nuclear facilities where we did nuclear security, nuclear weapons dismantlement, disposal. Also spent some time in Russia working on nuclear material security. But then after about 5 years, I said, I can't spend 20 years in the U.S. government. I'll go crazy. I mean, I'm a reformed bureaucrat, not a lifelong bureaucrat. And so I ended up working for a number of think tanks. Some of you may know the Carnegie Endowment, Joe Cirincione, who now runs the Plowshares Fund. I worked for Joe for 5 years. Worked at Center for Security International Studies with a number of people that went into the Obama administration for 3 years, and then got brought into Joe Biden's staff. Again, by coincidence, one of my good friends at CSIS shared an office with the guy who was setting up Vice President Biden's foreign policy staff. And they were saying, well, we need somebody who does nuclear. And Derek's like, well, Wolfsthal worked on the campaign. Why don't you hire him? I was like, okay, fine. So then I worked for Joe Biden. Again, it's all, sometimes, my closing line here is, sometimes you win just by showing up. I've done a lot of things in my life just by being in the right place at the right time and having a reputation that's seen as constructive and credible on these issues. Then I had kids. Working in the White House was not seen as a family-friendly occupation. Bill Potter called me up and said, Monterey is really nice. You can spend a lot of time with your family. Did that for a couple of years until I realized there's no good Chinese food in Monterey. And so I had to move back to Washington just because my stomach, it sometimes runs my head. And then I got pulled back into the White House by my boss on the vice president's staff had gotten promoted to be the deputy national security advisor to President Obama. And they needed a new nuclear policy director, and so I got brought in to work on those issues. So I basically have moved in and out of government for the last 30 years, but gotten to work on pretty much everything related to nuclear weapons in that time. I worked on the program that's trying to make Moly 99 out of low-enriched uranium instead of high-enriched uranium. I worked on the JCPOA. I helped negotiate the New START treaty with Russia. I helped write the Prague speech. I helped get President Obama to Hiroshima a little bit. Have gotten to do a number of just fascinating, wonderful, interesting things over the course of my life and been paid for it. So which is why I want to encourage you all to do it too, because it's remarkable what you can do if you have an idea and an interest and you're willing to pursue it.
Thank you.
Sure. Never give somebody from Washington a mic and never ask them about themselves. We go on and on.
So I understand that you believe that nuclear weapons do pose a big threat to this world, and you understand that proliferation definitely destabilizes our planet, but what's your opinion on peaceful uses of nuclear technology, for example, nuclear power plants or maybe nuclear-powered spaceships, just ways we can use the technology that's sometimes implemented in nuclear weapons for more peaceful and productive purposes?
It's a reality, right? I mean, we use nuclear power. We do have nuclear-powered satellites, and we will have nuclear-powered spaceships. Russia now is developing, nuclear-propelled cruise missiles, so I'm sure the idea of nuclear-powered aircraft, is going to come back. It's always two halves of the same coin, and we benefit from all kinds of roles of peaceful nuclear technology, whether it's cancer treatments or engineering or oil exploration. So there are all sorts of these positive uses. The challenge is not, are nuclear weapons bad over here, and are the really good things about nuclear power good over here? It's the intermix in the middle. And how do we responsibly manage that gray area where the technology needed for nuclear power is really useful in developing nuclear weapons? And are we smart enough? Are we committed enough? Are we principled enough to actually draw the line at a safe point so that we don't end up transferring nuclear weapons technology in the name of trying to support nuclear power and the peaceful uses? In 100 years, will we rely on the same kinds of nuclear power that we rely on today? Probably not, right? I mean, nuclear power reactors today are still sort of 50, 60-year-old technology, the same basic parameters. The hope is that we will get beyond that at some point, whether we get rid of all nuclear power for renewables or whether we figure out a way to do fusion, whatever it happens to be. We may avoid some of those challenges. But we're always going to have to deal with the fact that the knowledge that comes from perfecting the peaceful uses of nuclear energy is dual use. And there will be countries that, as long as nuclear weapons exist and as long as they're seen as legitimate, will want to pursue that technology, sometimes under the cover of a peaceful nuclear program. The examples that, again, were used in your presentations and that as part of the ban discussion is really relevant here. Right? Just because a weapons technology or a technology is old doesn't mean people stop using it or it stops being dangerous. Chemical weapons, biological weapons, gunpowder is hundreds of years old, right? But we still have to wrestle with those, and we haven't gotten it right yet. We haven't quite figured out how to manage the risks of proliferation of technology in nuclear in a way that prevents the spread of nuclear weapons. And that's, I think, a ripe field for people that have a scientific background, a legal background, that care about these issues. Maybe it's not on the weapons side. You're not going to become a deterrence expert. Maybe you're going to work on the civilian uses and the safeguards and how do you protect these things so that they don't end up becoming weapons programs. So,
Yeah, thank you.
sure. Please. I'm also going to assume my MCs will cut me off when...
Oh, last one.
Okay.
Could you tell us a little bit about how you got Obama to visit, former President Obama, to visit Hiroshima and the significance of that? And I'll wake up the students from Hiroshima so they can listen to you. Thank you.
I was joking at lunch that I just took my first visit to Hiroshima, and I keep telling the officials there that I really didn't have a big role in bringing Obama there, and they think I'm just being humble, right? Oh, no, it wasn't me. Many people involved. They're like, sure, we know it was you. So as the senior official at the White House for nonproliferation and arms control, the elected officials, the mayors and the governors from Hiroshima and from Nagasaki came to visit, and they wanted to offer an invitation to President Obama to come to those cities. And so I was the person that received them at the White House, and I told them very honestly that I think it would be a great idea for President Obama to visit Japan, to go to one or both of the cities, but that it wasn't my decision to make, and that there was a lot of nervousness about a sitting American president going to Japan and going to either Hiroshima or Nagasaki. How would the Japanese government feel? Not just the local prefecture government, but how would Prime Minister Abe feel? Was this a good thing or a dangerous thing? What if people protested? What if Hibakusha came out instead of feeling recognized and instead of feeling understood, they were angry that it took 70 years for a president to come and visit and protest. So there was a lot of nervousness. In the end, I recommended to the National Security Advisor that the president should go and wrote up a memo explaining why I thought the president should go. And they said, in fact, I'll tell you, so I went to Susan Rice, who's the National Security Advisor, and I said, Susan, I got a great idea. I think President Obama should go to Hiroshima. No sitting American president has ever been to Hiroshima. And she said, there's probably a really good reason that no sitting president has ever gone to Hiroshima. And we laid out that this would be a really valuable way for the president to force the US government bureaucrats to present him with new initiatives that he could announce at Hiroshima. It was a bureaucratic tool. When presidents go to summits, when presidents go to meet other leaders, they don't want to just go and give a speech. They actually want to go and make progress on issues. And so my hope was, by getting the president to go to Hiroshima, I could get the Pentagon to agree to eliminate more nuclear weapons. I could get the Department of Energy to agree to dismantle more weapons. That I could get the Budget Office to agree to reduce funding for nuclear weapons. But this is a great example for how things work in the US government. As perfect as my memo was, as well written and well argued, and as convincing as it was, I have a very limited amount of power in the US government. As the nuclear arms control guy, I'm a big fish in a little pond, if that makes sense. I have a lot of influence in a very small area. But the people who really have big influence are the people that manage our bilateral or our regional relationships. My counterpart who ran East Asia, who managed our relationship with Japan and South Korea and China, had a lot more influence over the president's decision-making than I did. So I didn't just go to Susan Rice. I went to the senior director for East Asia, who was Evan Madero's replacement, Dan Crittenbrink, but whom I knew through Evan. And he believed that this would be an example of the US and Japan demonstrating how we had dealt with our history and how we had overcome the legacy of World War II and show how communication and engagement could build security in the 21st century. And to do that in a way that looked directly at both Japan and South Korea, and said that if the US and Japan can get over our differences from World War II, Japan and South Korea can get over their differences, and also to go to the US, to Japan and China, and say that if we can get over our differences, then you have to be able to do this too. And there's a reason that 9 months later, Prime Minister Abe came to Pearl Harbor and laid a wreath, because it was a sign of our reconciliation. That message became much more powerful to President Obama than giving a nuclear policy speech at Hiroshima. So the idea was mine, but the implementation really was one that captured what the president was trying to do in East Asia more than what he was trying to do on nuclear issues. Now, I still think it was useful for nuclear issues, and we can take advantage of that, but in the end, it had as much to do with regional security and stability than it did about making history. That being said, I think that President Obama did like the idea of being the first. Presidents like to do things the first time, and so that had a big impact. But in the end, I played a very small role in what became a big event. That being said, I'm always happy to go and eat ramen in Hiroshima and tell people that story. All right, Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you so much for your work. Enjoy.